Welcome to the Mooney Gallery. The 77 art prints in the collection were given to the Charles City Public Library by Arthur Mooney, who is pictured here. We start with the three oldest prints in the collection. They're from the early days of the Northern Renaissance. The first artist seen here is Michael Wohlgemuth. He was considered one of the premier printmakers in German history, and his works for the devotional text Schatzbehalter were no exception. This particular print features an illustration of the biblical King Solomon and his many wives, and was one of the total 96 images that Wohlgemuth rendered for this specific book. The images served as a valuable accompaniment to the religious text as they conveyed the themes and characters of biblical stories to the largely illiterate population of 15th century Germany. Books such as these were often used as an aid to devotional practices, including meditation and prayer. This work displays many of the advances in pictorial tradition, from the relatively flat picture plane of the medieval style to the linear perspective of the Northern Renaissance. However, Wohlgemuth's work generally lacks the realism seen in later Northern European art. During his lifetime, Wohlgemuth also ran a workshop for younger printmakers. There the students learned and worked from 1486 to 1490. The next two prints in the gallery are the work of Albrecht Dürer, a student of Wohlgemuth's who exceeded his teacher. Born in Nuremberg, Germany in 1471, Dürer's work gained him early fame and recognition. This led to his traveling all over Europe to perfect his craft. Dürer's Adoration of the Magi and Marriage of the Virgin are from the series The Life of the Virgin, published in 1511. They contain 19 total prints detailing important biblical events in the life of the Virgin Mary. These specific prints contain technical advances in the woodcut process and employed chiaroscuro shading, whereas the artist would render a mid-tone to contrast shade and highlight in the image. These scenes feature a variety of figures which have been rendered in a more anatomically correct manner than the figures represented in Wohlgemuth's biblical scene. In addition to the identifiable characters in these scenes, look at the ornamentation over the arched doorway in the Marriage of the Virgin. Dürer has depicted women on lions battling men on horses, and also an owl. The women on lions are believed to represent the dangers of lust, and the owl is indicative of night. The sense of realism and visual perspective, coupled with the iconography, are very indicative of the period and region in which Dürer was working, and can be seen in works produced well into the Northern Renaissance. The series of 6 prints shown here are the work of Hermann Jans Müller, a Dutch engraver. They are based on the religious parable found in Matthew 25 of the Bible and depict the parable of the talents. In our first print by Müller, number 65, we can see the Lord handing each of his servants their sums of money. The next print, number 66, then details a cunning servant at a port, negotiating with another man, obviously investing the money in hopes of increasing the Lord's estate. The third print, number 67, focuses on the servant foolishly bearing his portion. In the fourth print, number 68, we see the return of a much older lord, coming home after years away, expecting his entrusted servants to present him with good news. However, the fifth in the series, number 69, reveals that the lowly third servant's attempts at merely hiding his entrusted gift were not appreciated. Our sixth and final print of this series, number 70, illustrates a vengeful lord pointing assertively at the third servant, who is receiving his punishment for hiding away what was entrusted to him for the use and investment. Here we see two works by Andrea Andreani. Andreani was born in Mantua, Italy in 1540 and died in Rome in 1623. Although not as well known as the masters he borrowed his imagery from, Andreani was nonetheless a talented craftsman of the chiaroscuro woodcut method. Working from roughly 1584 to 1610, his detailed prints often included multiple registrations or layers, and were some of the first in Italy to be printed in color. As was common for many printmakers in his time, his works were generally copies of masters like Dürer or Titian. In this case, he borrowed from Bartolomeo Corigliano for the first print, Virgin and the Child with St. John. Corigliano was an Italian painter and printmaker who was a contemporary of Andreani's. Andriani crafted the second print, Virgin and the Child with Saints, after a painting by Parmigiano, an older Italian painter and printmaker. The chiaroscuro woodcut method was developed in the early 16th century to achieve the look of a chiaroscuro drawing and used separately carved blocks for each color. The first print we see is by Jacques Collot. Collot was born in 1592 in the Duchy of Lorraine and produced this print of Saint Amandus in the year 1630. Often employing great depth and perspective in his prints, Collot gives the viewer a sense of presence in the scene. It's as if the viewer is among the audience of Saint Amandus's address. This scene is very likely Saint Amandus converting the pagans of Flanders to Catholicism, or possibly his miracle of resurrection of a hanged criminal sometime after the year 638. His evangelical mission eventually led to the proliferation of Catholicism across the Netherlands, which in turn led to the largely religious subject matter of Renaissance and Baroque Dutch art. This particular work is an etching, a process that uses chemistry to allow a metal plate, often copper, to be rendered acid-proof by being coated in wax until etched into with another metal tool. The plate is then submerged in an acid to render the design more effectively for registration. The metal surface is then covered with ink and sent through a press to force the ink out of the grooves. The next print we see is The Star of the Magi by Peter de Molin. Molin was an artist working during the Dutch Golden Age and produced mostly landscape paintings. The engraving seen before you, however, attests to the wide variety of endeavors that Molin pursued during his career. This included architecture, portraiture, and the scenes of everyday Dutch life. This particular scene depicts a group of Dutch folks singing in what appears to be a Christmas festival. Anthony van Dyck is the artist behind this portrait. He was a highly regarded painter of Flemish descent who specialized in portraiture. From an early age, Van Dyck displayed a keen talent for painting and was an accomplished artist by the age of 15. His talents led him to be appointed the official court painter of England. He was one of the most influential names in the English portraiture tradition. Van Dyck's paintings and engravings hang in museums, galleries, and private collections around the world. He is easily one of the most famous of his contemporaries. The portrait in our gallery depicts Franciscus van den Eden, the publisher of both Van Dyck and his teacher, Peter Paul Rubens. It is interesting to note that this print, like many by Van Dyck, were commercially released after his death in 1641. Likely born in Venice around 1611, Giulio Carpiani was an Italian painter and etcher of the early Baroque period. His subject matter was primarily historical or biblical images, and his depiction of the Holy Family was among this general oeuvre. He died at Verona in 1678 and was survived by his son, also an artist, Carlo Carpiani. Rembrandt van Rijn, most commonly known only by his first name Rembrandt, is considered one of the most important and influential artists of European history. His life began in 1606 in what is now the Netherlands, where he attended Latin school until being apprenticed under a few notable local painters. He eventually went on to open his own studio in 1624. From that point forward, he gained notoriety among wealthy members of Dutch society and was commissioned to do his works for them until he moved to Amsterdam. After his move to Amsterdam, Rembrandt began his preference for creating portraits. He also developed a lavish lifestyle and only ended up avoiding bankruptcy in 1656 by selling his collection of art and rarities, which included busts of Roman emperors, antique Japanese armor, and old master paintings and drawings. This lifestyle eventually led to his being banned by the Painters Guild, to which he was a member. The 4 prints displayed here highlight Rembrandt's range and skill. The first scene is Descent from the Cross, which was created at the height of Rembrandt's career. This work depicts very strong emotion and seems almost painting-like in its quality. The next print is one of over 100 self-portraits that Rembrandt created during his lifetime, including approximately 52 paintings, 32 etchings, and 7 drawings. Ecce homo is Latin for "behold the man." These words were attributed to Pontius Pilate, where he presents a tormented Christ bound and crowned with thorns to a crowd shortly before his crucifixion. Note the faces in the crowd and their various expressions. The last Rembrandt print shown here is an etching of Rembrandt's mother. He often used his mother as a model. Born in 1610 in the Dutch city of Haarlem, Adriaan van Ostade became the pupil of the portrait painter Frans Hals in 1627. Like many of the artists of his time, van Ostade was interested in everyday scenes of life around him, and this print, titled "Singers at a Window," is congruent with this trend. The shift in subject matter is indicative of the change in art patronage occurring in van Ostade's lifetime. The imagery of these works is often laced with notions of humor and defies the gravity of more traditional religious subject matter found in earlier art. Our next print is titled "The Carpenter." During a period of time in which the world was rapidly expanding, Allert van Everdingen was providing his patrons with images of exotic landscapes and scenes of man's conquering the wilderness, with clustered village scenes. This print is more enclosed, with no discernible horizon and trees extended beyond the picture plane. This is considerably different than the sweeping depth found in many of his other landscape works. Our next print is by Giovanni Benedetto Castiglione, who was a contemporary of Van Everdingen, and, like many Dutch patrons of that time, the Italians wanted images of the exotic Orient. The print on display here is likely a portrait of a man from the Near East, and would have been sold in Italy as a piece of exotic art. Castiglione was always considered a talented but troubled artist, having many encounters with the law, including nearly throwing his sister from a roof and several reported murders. Louis-Gerard Scotin, a French artist, worked during the beginning of the 18th century. At this time, the world of theater and opera began to influence art. The print here displays a scene of pastoral enjoyment with characters then popular in French theater. The characters shown are Perrault or Giles, 2 women, one of whom may be Columbine, and Harlequin, who is seen approaching. The title of this piece is translated as "The Jealous." It insinuates that somebody in this picture is jealous, and it is very likely Harlequin on finding the woman of his affections with his rival, Perrault. Unfortunately for the naive Perrault, she'll always end up leaving him for Harlequin, but in this scene, little Pete is on top. Our next print is by Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who was born in 1720 in Mogliano Veneto, part of the Republic of Venice. He was famous mostly for his etchings of Rome and of imaginary prisons. Although none of the works in this collection are of these prisons, and only one of them is recognizable as a place in Rome, it is easy to understand the stylistic darkness and mood of each of the works exhibited. It is also notable that many of Piranesi's works employed his active imagination, especially in his prison scenes, but even in his more academic images of places in Rome. Some of the details in his works were fabricated to suit the completeness that Piranesi desired. Last in this group is Giovanni Battista Tiepolo. He was an important figure in Italian painting and printmaking. His notoriety led him to travel around Europe, stopping for periods of time in Germany and Spain. This print has a compositional style that is very indicative of its Italian origin, but retains a very German sense of drama in the shading. This print was made around 12 years after Tiepolo returned to his home in Venice after a 3-year residence in Würzburg, Germany. Jean-Baptiste Jackson was an 18th century woodcut artist, known specifically for his work with chiaroscuro printing, whereas the artist would render a mid-tone by which to contrast shade and highlight and offer a range of colors in the image. However, not until the 1960s was Jackson considered either academically or artistically significant. In his book about the artist by Jacob Kineman, Jackson is credited as being one of the most harshly criticized artists of his time. Francisco Goya was considered by many to be the artist that catalyzed a turning point from the old world of painting to the period of modernity that followed him. His detailed accounts of two Spanish conflicts during the early 1800s, entitled The Disasters of War, are a gripping illustration of everything its title suggests. His works are often noted for their bold commentary on modern Spanish life. The print you see before you, its title, translated to "What a Beak of Gold," is a prime example of this commentary. It is from the satirical collection Los Caprichos. Goya was once quoted to have said of this print, "This looks a bit like an academic meeting. Perhaps the parrot is speaking about medicine. However, don't believe a word he says. There is many a doctor who has a golden beak when he is talking, but when he comes to prescriptions, he's a Herod. He can ramble on about pains, but can't cure them. He makes fools of sick people and fills the cemeteries with skulls." This particular print employs the printing method of aquatint. Like all intaglio printing methods, the artist scratches the surface of a plate to form grooves that hold ink. Aquatint, much like etching, is generally done on either zinc or copper plate and involves the application of an acid-resistant rosin in which the artist can etch into with a needle or acid. This rosin is generally referred to as a ground. The ground is applied either through an even coat of powder by which it is then heated, or the ground has been dissolved in spirits and is allowed to dry as an even coating on the plate. Once coated, the plate is submerged in acid for an initial biting, which renders a mid-tone from which the artist can either apply more ground or more acid, as well as engrave lines into the plate. The finished product can result in even gradients and smooth lines, often having a slightly watery look, hence the name aquatint. William Blake of London was a poet, painter, and printmaker during the Romantic period. Mostly unrecognized during his time and considered insane by many contemporaries, Blake's body of work has only continued to become more relevant and is now considered mostly ahead of its time. This wordy rendition of a biblical theme, in which Job is confronted by God, is a rather frightening image when closely inspected. The faces of Job and God, wrapped in a serpent, have seemingly identical expressions of sadness as Job painfully gazes upon the nightmare of hell beneath. The surrounding written material seems to be a statement from Job to Satan, in which Job claims that Satan persecutes him as if he were God. This juxtaposition of image and text definitely gives the viewer an interesting insight to the artist's intentions with this piece. Eugene Delacroix was a French Romantic painter and printer known for his ability to bring great emotion to the work of art. This reputation led to his being recognized as the leader of the Romantic painting movement in France. His expressive use of line and dynamic compositions often give the viewer a sense of action. This print of a young Clifford finding the body of his father on the battlefield of St. Albans shows us this sense of drama. Honoré Dumire was a printmaker, caricaturist, painter, and sculptor during the 19th century. This very prolific artist was known best for his caricatures of contemporary political personas. This dynamic image shows the three faces of past, present, and future. The expression of each face speaks volumes about the artist's views of each facet of this experience. Utagawa Hiroshige was a 19th century artist in Japan, one of the last masters of the ukiyo-e style. This famous and easily recognizable type of Japanese art includes images of kabuki actors wearing dramatic masks, folk scenes, travel accounts, and landscapes. Although some ukiyo-e artists were known for paintings, the majority of these works are woodblock prints. Unlike other methods of printmaking, this process employed a multitude of people to create the finished product, including an artist, a woodcarver, a printer, and a publisher. The artist would begin by rendering the image, which would then be cut into individual layers by the woodcarver. Once each layer had been carved, it would be sent to the printer where it would be inked and pressed against handmade paper. All of this production was funded by the publisher, who would eventually advertise, sell, and distribute the prints. Since these works were traditionally done by hand, it allowed for the opportunity to use techniques like radiance and blending that machines could not replicate at that time. 2 of the 3 prints here are from a larger series, the 53 Stations of the Tokaido. This series contains 55 illustrations of the 53 various views upon the Japanese road of Tokaido, which link the old capital city of Edo with the new capital, Kyoto. Each station is rendered in the beautiful Japanese tradition of woodblock and was one of the favorite styles of the French Impressionist Claude Monet. Born in Paris in 1821, Charles Marion is considered one of the best architectural etchers in history. Early in his career as an artist, he worked for almost nothing, which left him poverty-stricken. He used etching almost exclusively as a medium throughout his life. This is often credited to his being colorblind. Remaining a bachelor his entire life, his time was often split between his work and love, both of which engaged his active imagination. He eventually began hallucinating and was committed to an asylum after believing that he was Christ. He was released but died in an asylum after he was recommitted in 1867. The print seen before you is a prime example of his mastery of architectural prints. The next 5 prints in our collection are by James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Born in 1834 in Massachusetts, Whistler was a firm believer in the motto, "Art for art's sake." As a young man, Whistler was enrolled in the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg, Russia, while his family worked on the railroad. His father died in Russia, and his family was forced to move back to Connecticut. Whistler was enrolled in West Point, but his time there was limited. He was eventually dismissed by then-headmaster Robert E. Lee. Whistler worked briefly as a draftsman, but eventually lost that job due to his inclusion of serpents and mermaids in the margins of coastal maps. After losing this job, he concluded his career was to be an artist. Whistler left for Paris in 1855 to study art, and he never returned to the United States. His travels around Europe led to his preeminence as a painter and printmaker. Whistler died in London in 1903. If you look closely at the lower left-hand side of Hurlingham, you can make out his famous butterfly signature, which included a stinger, fitting for the man that was Whistler. His notable style and talent is evident in the span of works exhibited here in Charles City. Much like his aforementioned friend Whistler, Henri Fantin-Latour was exposed to artistic training at an early age. Henri's father, an artist, taught him how to draw as a child, and his talents developed from there as he attended art school and continued working into adulthood. Although Fantin was said to have befriended many of the Impressionists, like Monet, his style was always more traditional than his peers. This image created by Fantin resembles many of his portrait works, which always seem to employ a subtle use of light to encourage a mood. This portrait displays a man kneeling in what we can assume is a prayer, his hand outstretched in a gesture of pleading. This particular prayer is one of a whole series of prints detailing Richard Wagner, his life and works, and this print is Act 5. The print seen before you also uses a technique called lithography, which takes advantage of the natural inability to mix oil and water. A lithographer begins their process by rendering an image with a type of grease or wax onto a rigid, smooth, level surface such as limestone or metal. Then, a mixture of acid and gum arabic would be applied to the grease surface, etching away the bare stone or metal. After this, the entire surface is moistened, and the etched portions of the stone retain a small amount of water that repels the oil-based ink and retains only the original grease-based image. Paper is then applied to the surface to create a print. Alphonse Legros. Born in France, this master of many trades took the creative process very seriously in every endeavor that he tried. His initial schooling occurred in Dijon, where he pursued qualifications for a trade. Eventually, these skills would lead him to a variety of mediums and crafts that would earn him wide recognition for mastery of every process that he'd encounter. His success earned him modest wealth that he used to encourage many apprentices and students to travel to Italy to study art and craft. He worked as a professor at both South Kensington School of Art and later University College in London. Upon resigning his professorship in 1892, Legros' style reverted to his early years of imaginative landscapes, much like the abandoned village in this etching from 1894. Nathaniel Currier was born in Massachusetts in 1813. His father died when he was 8 years old, leaving him and his brother to provide for their family of 5. After scraping by with the odd job until he was 15, Currier got an opportunity to apprentice in the lithography shop of William and John Pendleton. This apprenticeship gave him a valuable craft experience and eventually led to him having the relatively successful endeavor in printing illustrations of current events under his own firm in 1835. The most popular of these were illustrations of disaster. After this initial success, the firm of N. Currier, lithographer, went from being a job printing facility to a primarily independent print publisher. James Merritt Ives was initially brought on as an accountant and a bookkeeper after Currier's brother Charles recommended him. After proving his worth not only as an efficient businessman, but also showing a keen sensibility of the kind of art the public wanted, Ives was promoted to partner. From that point forward, the two men worked together to become a household name and the most successful lithographers in the United States at that time. Their motto, publishers of cheap and popular prints, went from hand-colored lithographs to the full-colored artist work and painting reproductions. This Currier and Ives print is from the period in time when the print was an image rendered in black and white on the 3rd floor of the firm, and then the print would be hand-colored on the 5th floor. This means that although this is a print, somebody in 1875 actually sat down and individually painted the sweeping, colorful landscape and sky. Born in Paris in 1848, Paul Gauguin was the son of a journalist and the grandson of Flora Tristan, a founder of modern feminism. Gauguin and his family moved to Peru early in his life, and the culture and imagery he witnessed there shaped his style and approach to the artistic process for the rest of his working career. Although one of the more well-known artists of his time, Gauguin picked up his painting while working as a stockbroker and only committed to it as a profession when his marriage of 11 years dissolved and he returned to Paris in 1885. Much like his friend and fellow artist Vincent van Gogh, Gauguin struggled with depression and had attempted suicide at one time. In fact, Gauguin was in attendance to the infamous December 23rd incident in which Van Gogh had cut off his own earlobe with a razor blade. Gauguin claims to have been approached by the unstable Van Gogh earlier in the evening with the very same blade. The two never saw each other again after this, but kept in correspondence and remained friendly. The two prints in our collection display the generally flat and loose style that is indicative of the pre-Columbian art that Gauguin was influenced by, not only in his early home of Peru, but also by his 6-month stint in the French Caribbean. The figures and setting of these pieces convey little drama, but insinuate subtle emotion through the use of line and pattern. Note the serene and almost curious facial expressions exhibited by each of the women in these prints. Meanwhile, the textural and spatial environments defy traditional perspective and convey abstract setting for these seemingly delicate portraits. Edward Manet, not to be confused with Claude Monet, was a major figure in the transition from realism to the impressionistic movement in the 19th century. Born in Paris in 1832, Manet was the son of 2 upper-class families, but refused the future given to him to pursue his passion of painting. This passion would eventually lead him to become one of the most academically critical and innovative painters of modern art. His subjects were usually portraits, but his body of work revitalized the genre of history painting. Monet had an active sense of civic duty through art communication. His works generally conveyed a sense of leisure and focused primarily on the bourgeois environment he had grown accustomed to as a young man. The first of our 2 images is of this style and portrays a cat amongst flowers. It is a fine example of the aquatint method discussed in the section on Goya. Note the subtleties of tone throughout, ranging from a solid black to medium gray, and finally to the pure white of the cat's chest and neck. The second, but earlier work displays a group of gitanos or gypsies. The focal figure of this image looks travel-worn and gazes directly out at the viewer. This sense of an image having a gaze was a signature trait of many of Manet's works. The women and child are carefully placed in front of the older man, who seems to be preparing for a very large drink of wine. This image reiterates the very traditional style that Manet so carefully adjusted throughout his career, which led him to much fame and success. Another great leader in the Impressionist movement was Camille Pissarro, who was even a major voice in post-Impressionism. Camille Pissarro was a friend and mentor to many of the artists of his time. His fatherly guidance led to the collective works of artists such as Paul Gauguin, who used to paint in Pissarro's garden, and Paul Cézanne, our next artist, as well as Vincent van Gogh. Pissarro also holds the honor of being the only artist to have exhibited in all 8 of the Impressionist exhibitions in Paris. As an artist, Pissarro insisted on illustrating people as they were in everyday life and not dressed up in pre-envisioned set. The piece in our collection is entitled Street from the Grocery in Rouen and illustrates a scene of everyday life in the French city of Rouen in northern France. His loose and seemingly rushed image gives the viewer a sense of catching not only a scene, but a moment in history. The faint details of the distant turrets gives one a sense of lighting, and the haze of distant landmarks. 3 years before he created this piece, a critic described him as an object chronicler of one of the many facets of contemporary life. This legacy as a man of the moment was not always regarded highly, and many critics reacted badly to the initial onset of Impressionism, claiming its subject matter was vulgar and commonplace. Paul Cézanne was another of the formative artists during a time in which the purpose and nature of art was rapidly evolving. He is often credited as being an important figure in the shift from formalistic Impressionism to the bold new ideas of Cubism. His style was greatly influenced by the instruction and mentoring he received from Pissarro, but nonetheless was unique and innovative. His passing came in 1906 of pneumonia, only 7 years after he made the piece before you. Like many of his self-portraits, Cézanne has a beard, but unlike his early works, it is trimmed into a neat goatee. This portrait is not only of an image of a great artist, but also of an aging man. This is a glimpse through the eyes of Cézanne, who was 60 years old and practically hermited away in a cabin with his wife at the time. His mother had died 2 years ago, and he had been struggling with diabetes for 9 years. After 4 years of living in the cabin, however, Cézanne and his wife separated, and he opened a new studio and painted there until his death. Paul Hilou was a French artist known for his portraits of upper-class women such as the one shown here. His career as an artist almost ended prematurely until he met Jean-Jacques Tissot. Tissot showed Hilou the wonders of dry-point etching with a diamond-tipped stylus, and from that point forward, Hilou's prints were imbued with the gesture and energy of his pastels. This style of etching was both popular and easily produced, which led to the meteoric success and eventually to his friendship with Coco Chanel, the fashion designer. It was under Hilou's guidance that Chanel chose beige as her signature color, and eventually Hilou's son and grandson would go on to be artistic directors for the Chanel brand. Like many of the artists in this collection, George Bellows is considered one of the more prestigious artists of his time. In the year 1904, Bellows left his academic and athletic success at Ohio State to study art in New York City under Robert Henri. His time there associated him with the American Realist movement and the Ashcan School, which encouraged the painting of all aspects of contemporary American society. His work ranges from scenes of common life in New York City to vividly captured scenes of boxing matches. The piece in our collection dates back to 1916, during Bellows' brief years as a contributor to a socialistic journal called The Masses, which was eventually censored and banned from being shipped by mail after the passage of the Espionage Act in 1917. The print itself is a scene of an evening out in New York City, rendered with the dramatic sense of lighting that it is so indicative of Bellows' style. The way faces and bodies seem to appear out of dark corners and crowded spaces gives the viewer a sense of what life was like during the beginning of the 20th century in the Big Apple. Louis Orr was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1879. His father, uncle, and grandfather were all printmakers and discouraged him from the artistic professions. But despite their pleas, he traveled to France at the age of 27 to study art and to work in the studio of J.P. Lawrence. By the 1920s, Orr was one of the most in-demand artists of his time, both in Europe and America, for his architectural prints. This beautiful print of the U.S. Capitol was made at the height of his career and is a testament to the precise talent he possessed. Along with Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Wood, who are the next two artists in our collection, John Stuart Curry of Kansas was one of the major figures in the American regionalist movement. These three artists, all from the Midwest, illustrated the rural and agrarian life of the world around them, and almost no collection in this area is without at least one of their works. Unlike the other two regionalists, however, Curry was not much for the power and politics of art, but rather a purveyor of art to the common man. His images were largely popular during the Great Depression, as the general population had become disenfranchised with the promises of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. The charming scenes of the American heartland helped to encourage and distract those fallen on financial hardship. Curry was made most famous by his mural works in the Kansas state capitol, which were commissioned by newspaper editors, but were eventually left unfinished after a legislative committee barred a number of incorrect or controversial details from being included in the designs. Despite national popularity, his home state was less than impressed by his renditions of typical Kansan life, and many expressed that they were embarrassed by the stereotypes being perpetuated in his works. The print in our collection is part of a larger body of work illustrating scenes from a big tent circus act. This desperate moment in a trapeze show is caught in the artist's illustration, much as the desperation felt in the Midwest as the Dust Bowl raged across in the 1930s. Thomas Hart Benton has been a strong and sometimes controversial figure in Missouri state history. He was born in Neosho, Missouri in 1889 to an influential family of politicians. His father was a lawyer and had been elected to Congress 4 times, but it was his mother's encouragement towards the arts that led him down the path to success. Although he is admired and recognized as a native of Missouri, he traveled for a good portion of his life to study art. His homeland has always influenced his work, however. Curry left home to attend Chicago Art Institute in 1907 and then went on to Paris 2 years later. His mother supported his pursuit of art emotionally and financially as he continued to work and make connections in Europe. He later moved to New York City and was shortly thereafter serving in the Navy during World War I. His station was in Virginia, and his mission was to draw the camouflage ships as they entered the harbor. He credits this as being one of the most important things he had ever done for himself as an artist. The piece in our collection, entitled Going Home, emphasizes Benton's frustration with his position in the art world at the time. He felt he had alienated himself from his community of artists for remaining apathetic about politics, and his style had lost its novelty in Paris. This sense of alienation led him to leave New York City for Kansas City, Missouri in 1935 and began teaching at the Kansas City Art Institute. This exposure to rural America revitalized his regionalist zeal, and he produced some of his greatest works of his life there. It's as if Benton, much like the farmer, left for home and never looked back. Grant Wood is easily one of the most well-known regionalists. He was born 4 miles east of Animos, Iowa in 1891. His family moved to Cedar Rapids in 1901 after the death of his father. He became an apprentice at a local metal shop that same year, and after graduating high school in 1910, he left for art school in Minneapolis. After returning home to teach in a one-room schoolhouse for 2 years, he enrolled in the Chicago Art Institute. He traveled to Europe in the 1920s and studied the contemporary styles of painting, but it is said that the Northern Renaissance artist Jan van Eyck was most influential to Wood's style. The pieces in our collection are 2 lithographs, one of which is personally inscribed to Arthur Mooney. Both display the smooth and whimsical style that Wood used to illustrate his scenes towards the end of his tragically short career. Wood died of pancreatic cancer 1 day before his 51st birthday in 1942. Elizabeth Betty Carney was a teacher, a painter, and a printmaker from Minnesota. She studied art in Minneapolis and graduated from Fontainebleau School of Fine Arts in France with a degree in fresco. This image, Italian Fisherman, was exhibited first in the Minnesota State Fair in 1939 and indicates the strong influence of the regionalist style during that time. The smooth planes of gradient and the almost cartoonish figures resemble the works of other artists of this time and place in art history. Pablo Picasso is arguably one of the most well-known artists in recent history and is credited with the development of Cubism, the first abstract style of modern art. His immense body of work ranged through a variety of periods and styles, varying in subject matter from grave seriousness to laughable absurdity. The two Picasso prints in our collection display a sense of the aforementioned variety in his works, one being the rough and textured etching of a donkey, and the other a minimalistic rendition of a classical Greek scene. Let's look closer at the first, Lawn. This print employs a technique that few have mastered outside of Picasso, the sugar lift etching. This process, much like the other etching processes, involved the use of a metal plate, usually zinc, an acid-resistant substance, and acid. However, this process also involves the use of sugar and ink to render the original image onto the plate. Once dry, the plate is coated with an acid-resistant ground and after that washed. As the water washes away the coating, the sugar and ink beneath the ground cause it to wash away, leaving a negative of the image remaining in the ground. The plate is then placed in an acid bath to etch the bare metal, and once finished etching is cleaned and applied with ink. The ink is then wiped away, leaving it in the etched grooves, and it is pressed into a slightly moistened paper. This process allowed Picasso to etch precisely his expressive brushstrokes and to create a finer texture. Continuing in a theme of minimal renditions, our next piece is by the French artist Henri Matisse. Although not as famous as Picasso, Matisse was a very influential artist in his day, employing a loose and original style that was all his own. Matisse was criticized as being a fauve or wild beast at the beginning of his career, but eventually came to be recognized as a figurative artist in the traditional sensibilities of French painting. His work comes from an impressive career of over 50 years. The print itself is from a collection of love poems by Ronsard, used as a concept by Matisse in 1941. The inscription from the poem professes love for the golden hair of the woman pictured, and mentions feelings of jealousy towards her comb, for it has the pleasure of flowing through the golden locks each morning. This collection of love poems finally came to fruition as a work of 126 lithographs in 1946 after many delays due to the process of matching the text to image, printing issues, and World War II. Unlike Matisse's previous attempts, the final works were composed with image and text together. The next artist whose work displayed here is Raphael Soyer. Born in Russia in 1899, but later an American, Soyer was a well-known painter, draftsman, and printmaker. His work consisted mostly of portraits of everyday people, places, in New York City during the middle of the 20th century, which offered him no lack of interesting and unique subjects. He held a strong belief in the value of representational art and was decidedly against the trend towards abstraction during his career. His honest and elegant portraits convey a sense of presence, as if the woman in this etching is just about to move. Luigi Lucioni was born in Malnate, Italy in 1900, although his family immigrated to New York City in 1911. A successful student, Lucioni stopped attending school after completing the 8th grade until he started attending college at age 15. His presence at Cooper Union in Manhattan came about by way of a competition. He was always considered a strong-minded person with a touch of stubbornness and a strict adherence to his own particular style with no sense of contemporary trends. The technically sound etching serves as a wonderful rendition of two barns beneath expertly rendered oak trees. Our next artist, Alexander Calder, was best known for his work with the mobile. His mobiles were kinetic structures that would balance and suspend components in space as they moved. Ironically, his static sculptures were referred to as stabiles. Calder originally chose to study mechanical engineering, and when asked about his decision, he commented, "I wanted to be an engineer because some guy I rather liked was a mechanical engineer. That's all." His good nature and charming sense of humor were appreciated by anyone who became acquainted with him. After graduating with a degree in mechanical engineering, Calder began his career as an artist while working as a timekeeper at a logging camp in Aberdeen, Washington. He wrote home to request paint and brushes after having been inspired by the scenery, and soon thereafter devoted his working life to a career in art. This prompted a move to New York City and an enrollment in the Art Students League, where he studied briefly with Thomas Hart Benton. His journey with printmaking began in Paris in 1926 and eventually led to the color lithograph Before You. The geometric shapes and connecting lines are seemingly two-dimensional representations of his abstract sculpture work at the time. Their appearance, similar to balloons or large balancing shapes, is perhaps an intentional lack of clarity, prompting the viewer to contemplate the sensation of weight. Marc Chagall was considered to be the quintessential Jewish artist of the 20th century and worked in a variety of mediums, including painting and printmaking. Although he is not credited with the genesis of any particular art movement, he participated in many major movements of his time. His contribution to the art world is greatly admired for its rich use of color and a deeply rooted cultural sense of narrative. The two prints by him in our collection were created during his residence in the Holy Land while working on prints for a collection illustrating scenes from the Bible. The first, Homecoming, was created 2 years after his arrival and perhaps conveys the affection that the native Russian felt in the land of his ancestors as he illustrated scenes from the ancient cities around him. The second print is one of the biblical scenes that Chagall was working on during his stay. It expresses a deep sense of identity in the tradition and symbols used to depict this scene from Exodus. To quote Chagall, "I did not see the Bible, I dreamed it. Ever since early childhood, I have been captivated by the Bible. It has always seemed to me, and still seems today, the greatest source of poetry of all time." Salvador Domingo Felipe Jacinto Dali, commonly known as Salvador Dali, was considered by many not to only be a great artist, but also an incredibly strange man. Dali's career is well documented and serves as a standard in the modern canon. He was simply the figurehead of the surrealistic movement. His often eccentric behavior drew more attention than his genius body of work, much to the frustration of his critics, and relied upon the encouragement of his surrealistic friends like Man Ray and Andre Breton. His antics influenced the deeply cerebral nature of his work, which depended on evoking one's subconscious to interpret its meaning. The dreamlike atmosphere in which the Virgin and Child are enshrined is similar to those seen in his other paintings, and speaks of an endlessly complicated series of layers. Although Dali's print is the most recent in the collection, two other artists' prints also hang outside the gallery. These include 4 etchings by Lucas Gassel. The other prints are a series by Stefano Della Bella